You ever notice how every dog training video makes it look easy? One whistle, one treat, and suddenly the dog's a genius. Yeah, real life doesn't work like that. When I decided to train my dog Daisy, I thought it'd be a fun bonding project. Man and his loyal companion, learning together. What I got instead was a full-scale power struggle. One retired man with too much optimism, and one beagle with absolutely no respect for authority. By the end of it, Daisy was sitting on command, and I was the one rolling over. So here's the thing about dog training. Everybody says it's about consistency, rewards, patience. They make it sound like a spiritual journey. In reality, it's more like a test of who gives up first. You or the dog. I've had dogs my whole life. Smart ones, lazy ones. One that could open the fridge. Another that thought thunder was a government conspiracy. But Daisy? She's in a category all her own. Sweet as can be, but stubborn, like a tax form. When Linda suggested I teach her a few simple commands, I thought, sure, why not? It'll be good for both of us. A little exercise, a little bonding. How hard could sit possibly be? Turns out, that question aged about as well as milk on a summer porch. So it all started one Saturday morning. The kind of morning where the coffee's strong, the sky's clear, and your confidence is way too high for what you're about to attempt. Linda was in the kitchen, reading something about positive reinforcement. Daisy was in the backyard, chasing her tail like it owed her money. And I was standing there, armed with a clicker, a bag of treats, and the misplaced belief that I was about to change her life. The first command was, sit. Simple enough. It's the one they always start with. Every YouTube trainer makes it look foolproof. You hold up a treat, say sit, and the dog instantly lowers itself like it just passed obedience school with honors. Except Daisy looked at me, wagged her tail, and walked away. No hesitation, no confusion, just pure, unbothered defiance. Daisy, I said, we're doing this together. She blinked. I could almost hear her say, sure we are, old man. I followed her across the yard, treat bag rustling like an amateur magician. Sit, I repeated. Nothing. She turned her back and started sniffing the fence. I moved closer. Sit. She glanced over her shoulder like, you talking to me or the fence? I clicked the clicker, thinking maybe the sound would trigger something. She froze, then barked, not at me, at the clicker. Apparently, Daisy believed this small plastic device was the enemy. She lunged, teeth first, straight at it. I tried to stay calm. Dog training books always say, keep a calm energy. So there I was, standing in my yard, holding a slobber-covered clicker, trying to radiate calm while my dog glared at it like it had insulted her ancestors. After 10 minutes of pure chaos, Linda came outside holding her coffee. She leaned against the door frame with that look wives have when they already know how this story ends. How's it going, Dr. Doolittle? I muttered something about early progress. She smiled and said, you know she's part beagle, right? You can't bribe a beagle. They negotiate. That's when I realized I was in trouble. See, Daisy didn't want obedience. She wanted partnership. If I gave her a command, she wanted to know what was in it for her. Every sit was a business deal. Every stay was a debate. And come, that was a full-on philosophical discussion. By the second day, I developed a system. Treats in my left pocket, clicker in my right, Daisy in the middle, pretending not to hear me. I'd say sit. She'd tilt her head. I'd show her the treat. She'd bark once, as if to say, I'm listening, but the terms could be better. I increased the reward. 1 treat became 2, then 3. By the end of the week, Daisy had learned absolutely nothing, except that standing her ground got her extra snacks. On the 4th day, I brought in props, a leash, a cone, even a little mat for her designated sitting area. I thought maybe the visual aid would help. It did not. Daisy took one look at the mat, decided it was a new toy, and shredded it into confetti within 30 seconds. Linda watched from the window. I could see her trying not to laugh. By that evening, I was desperate. I turned to online forums, reading advice from people who all claimed to have the secret. One said to use a firm voice. Another said to whisper. One guy wrote, eye contact is everything. So I tried it. I got down on one knee, looked Daisy in the eye, and said softly, sit. She sneezed in my face. Twice. Apparently that was her answer. At this point, I started questioning who was training whom. She'd figured out my schedule. If I walked toward the kitchen drawer where the treats were, she'd sprint to the door and start performing random behaviors. Half-sits, fake rollovers, tail spins, just to see what worked. It was like watching an improvisational artist perform a one-dog show titled How to Manipulate a Human in 10 Easy Steps. The real breaking point came when I introduced the leash. I figured if she could master sit, stay, and heel, we could finally take peaceful walks together. Spoiler, we did not. The first time I clipped on the leash, Daisy acted like I'd insulted her freedom. She froze, then flopped dramatically onto her side, refusing to move. I tugged gently. Nothing. I tugged again. Still nothing. I ended up dragging her 3 feet across the grass like a sack of potatoes. Linda opened the back door and shouted, "You sure she's the one being trained?" I pretended not to hear. That's when I realized dog training isn't about teaching them what to do. It's about discovering how far you're willing to embarrass yourself in the process. Every mistake I made, Daisy learned from. She'd wait for me to slip. If I gave her a treat before saying the command, she'd note it down mentally like a union negotiator. If I raised my voice, she'd tilt her head and walk away, offended. If I sighed, she'd wag her tail, knowing she'd just won another round. By day 7, I was mentally defeated. The once confident trainer had turned into a broken man, sitting in the grass, holding a half-empty treat bag, whispering to a dog who was now sunbathing instead of training. That's when Linda sat beside me and said, "You know, Henry, maybe she doesn't need training. Maybe she just needs you to stop trying so hard." I laughed. Then I looked over at Daisy. snoring, belly up, completely at peace. And it hit me. Maybe Linda was right. Maybe the problem wasn't Daisy's disobedience. Maybe it was my expectation that everything had to go perfectly. Because that's the truth about training. Dogs, people, life. You can read every guide. You can plan every step. But real learning happens when you let go a little. Still, I wasn't ready to quit. Oh no, I'm a stubborn man. And if Daisy was going to test me, I was going to return the favor. So the next morning I came out armed with a brand new plan. A calm mind, a single command, and 0 treats. Just me and the clicker. I started with a simple sit, no reward, no lecture, just patience. She looked at me. I waited. And then, out of pure boredom or pity, she sat. I couldn't believe it. I clicked. And instead of cheering like a fool, I just smiled and whispered, "Good girl." That tiny victory changed everything, because the moment I stopped trying to win, we started working together. Turns out, Daisy didn't want a boss. She wanted a partner. She didn't respond to control. She responded to respect. It's funny. You spend your life thinking wisdom comes from age, but sometimes it comes from a 25-pound beagle who refuses to sit until you learn to chill out. The next few days were smoother. Not perfect, but better. She'd sit half the time, stay when she felt like it, and heel only if she spotted a squirrel first and decided it wasn't worth the effort to chase it. But for us, that was progress. Linda called it Henry's Miracle Week. I called it Negotiations Phase 2. By now, Daisy and I had found a rhythm. Our training sessions were shorter, more fun, less about getting it right, more about enjoying the time together. She still messed up. So did I. But the pressure was gone. There was one moment, though, a particularly low one, that tested everything. We were walking down the street, leash in hand, when a squirrel darted out of a bush. Daisy lunged. I held on. And in that moment, both of us learned something about physics. She pulled hard. I slipped. And the next thing I knew, I was lying flat on my back in a pile of leaves, holding an empty leash. Daisy was halfway down the block, tail wagging like she'd just won the marathon. I sat up, brushed myself off, and thought, so much for heel. When I finally caught up, she looked so proud of herself I couldn't even be mad. She turned the whole thing into a game, and I realized this was never about training a perfect dog. It was about learning patience and humility, and how to laugh when your neighbor spots you chasing a beagle through 3 front yards while still wearing slippers. By the end of that week, I had a whole new perspective. I wasn't a failed trainer. I was a work in progress, and so was Daisy. Together we were learning the same lesson. Control doesn't build trust. Connection does. These days, Daisy listens most of the time, and honestly, that's enough. She still ignores me when the mailman comes. She still pretends not to know stay if the doorbell rings. But she also curls up beside me every night. And that feels like success in its own way. I used to think training was about mastering commands. Now I think it's about mastering patience. Daisy didn't fail the lessons. She just rewrote them, and I learned to follow along. Now that I'd had my so-called breakthrough, I figured it was smooth sailing from here. Spoiler alert, it was not. The next morning I woke up early, ready for round 2. Coffee in hand, treats in pocket. Optimism freshly brewed. Daisy was waiting by the door, tail wagging, ears perked up like she knew something was coming. I looked at her and said, "You ready to learn, partner?" She sneezed, which I decided to take as a yes. We stepped out into the yard. The sun was just climbing over the fence. Birds were chirping. It was one of those calm mornings that make you feel like anything's possible. And then Daisy found a squirrel. So much for calm. She bolted. The leash snapped tight. My coffee went airborne. And I suddenly learned that caffeine looks a lot more dramatic when it's flying in slow motion. By the time I regained balance, Daisy was already halfway across the yard, nose buried in the bushes. Training session number 2 had officially begun, with chaos. I took a deep breath. "Okay, Daisy. Let's focus." She emerged from the bush with a stick the size of a baseball bat. I said, "Drop it." She looked at me, wagged her tail, and trotted the other way. I said louder, "Drop it." She sped up. Apparently, in Daisy's mind, drop it meant run faster, make it a chase. So, there I was, a 60-something man chasing a beagle in slippers around the backyard, yelling commands that sounded less like training and more like desperate negotiation. Linda opened the kitchen window and called out, "You two having fun out there?" I yelled back, "We're bonding." She laughed. "Looks more like cardio." After 10 minutes, Daisy finally got tired. She dropped the stick right in front of me, then flopped on her back for belly rubs. And I'll admit, I gave in, because that's what soft-hearted trainers do. She didn't follow the command, but she knew how to win the war. Day 3, I decided to step up my game. I read that dogs learn better when training feels like play. So I bought one of those little agility tunnels and a set of cones from the pet store. The cashier asked if I was starting a dog sports league. I told him no. Just trying to survive. I set everything up in the yard like a miniature obstacle course. It looked impressive. Linda even said, "Wow, Henry. That actually looks professional." And for a brief moment, I believed it might work. Daisy trotted out, sniffed the tunnel, and immediately climbed on top of it. Not through it. On top. Like a queen surveying her kingdom. Then she plopped down and yawned. So I did what any desperate man would do. I crawled into the tunnel myself to show her. Now, if you've never been 60+ years old, wedged inside a plastic tunnel designed for small dogs, let me tell you, it's humbling. Linda recorded the whole thing on her phone. I heard her giggling from the patio. And when I finally crawled out, grass in my hair and dignity somewhere behind me, Daisy licked my face like, "Nice effort, coach." I was starting to think maybe Daisy didn't need agility. Maybe she needed therapy. Or maybe I did. By week 2, the sessions had become part of our routine. Morning coffee, training attempt, mild humiliation. Repeat. But somewhere between the failed tricks and chewed leashes, something started to shift. Daisy began paying attention. Not always, but sometimes. Enough to give me hope. One day she actually responded to "Stay." I held out my hand, said the word, and she froze for a solid 5 seconds. Then she sneezed again. Apparently, sneezing is her form of applause. I'll take it. But of course, for every success, there's a disaster waiting. And mine arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. I'd invited my neighbor Carl over to watch the progress. Carl's one of those guys who swears he's a dog whisperer because his Labrador once brought him the newspaper. He stood there with his hands on his hips and said, "Mind if I give it a shot?" I said, "Be my guest." He took the leash, puffed out his chest, and said, "Sit." Daisy sat instantly. No hesitation, no bargaining, just obedience. Carl turned to me with that smug grin that only neighbors named Carl can have. "See? It's all about energy, Henry. Dogs can sense weakness." I laughed politely, but inside, I was plotting ways to sabotage his garbage cans later that night. After he left, I looked at Daisy and said, "Traitor." She wagged her tail. No shame whatsoever. I started noticing something else, too. Daisy wasn't ignoring me out of defiance. She was reading me. If I got impatient, she tuned out. If I relaxed, she listened. It was like holding up a mirror I didn't want to look into. Turns out, dogs are excellent teachers of self-awareness. One afternoon, I decided to practice come. Simple command, 2 syllables, supposedly universal. I knelt down and called, "Daisy, come." She looked at me, then at the open gate, and in that split second, I realized I'd made a terrible mistake. She bolted straight through the gate and down the street. I ran after her, yelling her name. The neighbors came out to watch, coffee cups in hand like it was a live show. "Morning, Henry," one of them said. "Morning," I yelled, sprinting after my dog. Just doing cardio with emotional consequences. I finally caught her 3 blocks down, nose deep in someone's flower bed. I clipped the leash back on, out of breath, and said, "You're lucky you're cute." She wagged her tail like, "You're lucky I came back." When we got home, Linda was waiting on the porch. She asked, "Did you two have a nice adventure?" I said, "Yeah." "We're both learning to embrace failure." She smiled. "Sounds like marriage." That night I did some thinking. Maybe dog training isn't about commands at all. Maybe it's about trust. And maybe Daisy needed me to trust her first. So the next morning I changed my approach completely. No clicker, no treat bribes, no fancy tunnels. Just quiet time together. We sat in the yard. I didn't say a word. She sniffed the air, wandered a bit, then came and sat beside me on her own. It wasn't obedience, it was connection. And that felt better than any perfect sit ever could. But of course, progress never comes without setbacks. That evening, Linda decided to help. She read online about teaching dogs to shake hands. She said, "It's easy, Henry. You just lift her paw and reward her, I told her. Linda, nothing about this dog is easy. But she was determined. She crouched down, took Daisy's paw, said, "Shake," and handed her a treat. It worked. Once. Then Daisy realized she didn't need the word shake anymore. She just started slapping everyone's leg with her paw to get snacks. Now every time I sit on the couch with Chips, she whacks my knee like a tiny mob boss demanding her cut. Linda says it's cute. I say it's extortion. Still, it's progress. Over time, Daisy and I started understanding each other's rhythms. I'd say, "Stay." She'd pause just long enough to make eye contact before doing the exact opposite. But I could tell. She knew what I was asking. She just didn't always care. Which, honestly, I respect. At her age, she's got nothing to prove. Then came the day of our biggest challenge yet, the public park. Linda said, "You've been practicing at home. Time to test her skills in the real world." I should have known real world meant complete chaos. The park was full of kids, joggers, other dogs, and about 7,000 squirrels. We hadn't even made it past the parking lot before Daisy's eyes went wide. I whispered, "Remember what we practiced?" She looked at me like, Sure. I'll remember right after I chased that poodle. For the first 5 minutes, she was perfect. Sat on command, stayed close, didn't bark once. I thought, this is it. We finally made it. Then a guy jogged past with a squeaky toy hanging from his backpack. That's when all bets were off. Daisy lunged like a furry missile. I held on to the leash for dear life, sliding 2 feet forward before regaining control. People stared. One kid yelled, "Mister, your dog's winning." I said, "I know, kid. Believe me, I know." After that day, I learned to appreciate the small wins, like when Daisy came when called, even if it was just for dinner, or when she sat politely before I filled her bowl, or when she finally stopped barking at the vacuum. Every tiny step felt like a gold medal. And honestly, those small moments started to change our whole relationship. We weren't fighting each other anymore. We were figuring it out together. I stopped expecting perfection. She stopped testing my patience. Well, mostly. And somewhere between stay and maybe later, we became a team. One evening, as the sun was setting, I sat on the porch watching her chase fireflies. Linda came out and asked, "So, Professor Henry, did Daisy finally graduate obedience school?" I smiled and said, "She dropped out. But she's running the faculty now." We both laughed. Because that's the thing about dogs. They're not meant to be perfect. They're meant to remind us to loosen up, to find joy in the chaos, to love without a plan. When I look at Daisy now, I don't see a failed student. I see a happy little teacher who spent weeks showing me how to slow down, laugh more, and stop treating life like a checklist. So yeah, maybe my dog never mastered rollover, but she taught me something better. Sometimes the best training is just learning when to stop talking and listen. It all came down to one Saturday afternoon. The big test. The day I thought Daisy and I would finally prove that all our effort meant something. Linda had invited the neighbors over for a backyard barbecue, and she, in her infinite wisdom, told everyone I'd give a little training demonstration. She said it so casually, like I was some kind of professional dog whisperer, instead of a man whose main accomplishment was convincing Daisy not to eat my slippers. By noon, the yard was full, kids running around, Carl standing near the grill, pretending to know how propane works, Linda serving lemonade like she was hosting a daytime talk show, and me, pacing nervously, holding Daisy's leash like it was my diploma. I'd planned out the perfect routine, a few simple commands. Nothing fancy. Sit, stay, come. Then maybe a polite handshake to end it all. That was the plan, and if life has taught me anything, it's that plans are just comedy waiting to happen. I took a deep breath. "All right, everyone," I said. "Daisy and I have been working hard. This'll be a quick demo of her progress." Carl smirked. He whispered something to his wife, probably betting against me. I turned to Daisy. She looked calm, focused, ears perked, eyes locked on me. For a moment I thought this might actually work. "Sit," I said. She sat. Gasps of approval from the audience. I felt 10 feet tall. "Stay." She froze, didn't even blink. I was halfway to legend status. Then came the command that would decide my fate. "Come." She hesitated, then slowly stood up. Everyone leaned forward. Carl crossed his arms. I smiled, confident. She took one step toward me, then another. Then, out of nowhere, she spotted something behind me. A hot dog, half eaten, sitting on a paper plate at the edge of the picnic table. It might as well have been the Holy Grail. She darted past me so fast the leash burned my hand, straight to the table, knocked over a cup, grabbed the hot dog, and bolted across the yard with her prize. The crowd went silent, then burst out laughing. Someone shouted, "Guess she came after all." Linda tried to hide her smile behind a napkin. Even Carl couldn't resist. "Hey, Henry, maybe she's training for a food heist." I just stood there, leash in hand, hot dog bun on the grass, dignity somewhere near the bushes. Daisy did a victory lap around the yard, hot dog hanging from her mouth like a trophy. Every time I tried to call her, she ran faster. The kids cheered. Someone started clapping. And me? I laughed. Because what else could I do? It was chaos. Pure, joyful chaos. And in that moment, I realized something. All my effort to control her, to shape her into the perfect obedient pet, had completely missed the point. She was having fun. She was being herself. And for the first time in weeks, so was I. Eventually, Daisy trotted back, dropped the soggy hot dog at my feet, and sat. Perfect posture, tongue out, proud as ever. I looked down and said, "You planned this, didn't you?" She tilted her head like, "Of course I did." The crowd gave us a round of applause, not for the routine I'd planned, but for the show Daisy had delivered. Linda came over, smiling. She said, "See, Henry?" She performed beautifully, just not the way you expected. And she was right. It wasn't failure. It was life reminding me to lighten up. After everyone left, I sat on the porch steps with Daisy beside me. She leaned against my leg, panting, still proud of her performance. I scratched her ears and said, "You know, Daisy, you may never win obedience awards, but you've got perfect comedic timing." That evening, as the sun set and the last of the laughter faded, I thought about what had really happened. It wasn't a disaster. It was a breakthrough. Because up until that day, I'd been trying to make her fit into my idea of a well-trained dog. But Daisy had her own idea, her own pace, her own version of success. And maybe, just maybe, that was better. When you get older, you start realizing how much of life is about control. You try to keep things neat, predictable, manageable. You want order. But dogs, especially ones like Daisy, remind you that chaos can be beautiful too. That sometimes you've got to let the hot dog go. The next morning, I woke up early again. I made coffee, opened the back door, and instead of reaching for the leash or the clicker, I just stood there. Daisy ran out, chasing the morning air. She rolled in the grass, barked at a butterfly, and came trotting back with a stick twice her size. She dropped it at my feet, tail wagging. I said, "Sit," and she did. Calm, steady, no bribery, no drama, just quiet understanding. And that's when it hit me. All this time she'd been training me, teaching me patience, teaching me presence, teaching me to stop trying to control every outcome and just enjoy the moment I was in. It's funny. When you're younger, you think wisdom comes from success. You think you have to get everything right. But standing there, with that dog looking up at me, I realized wisdom sometimes comes from the mess, from the missteps, from the runaway hot dogs and chewed up slippers. Daisy sat there proudly, waiting for her treat. I gave her one, of course. Then I gave her another. Because at this point, who's counting? Linda came out with her coffee and said, "You look peaceful. Did Daisy finally graduate obedience school?" I smiled. Better. She promoted me to assistant. We both laughed. Later that day, we took a walk through the neighborhood. Leash loose. No pulling, no barking. Just an easy rhythm. People waved. Someone asked, "Hey, Henry, how'd you finally get her to listen?" I said, "Simple. I stopped talking so much because that's the truth. Dogs don't always need commands. Sometimes they just need company. And sometimes that's all we need too." That night, as Daisy curled up at my feet, I thought back to the very first day. The chaos, the frustration, the feeling of failure, and I couldn't help but laugh. Because if you told me then that all that mess would lead to this quiet peace between us, I wouldn't have believed it. But that's how it goes. You think you're teaching them to sit. They're really teaching you how to be still. You think you're showing them discipline. They're showing you grace. And somewhere between bad dog and good girl, you both grow up a little. So yeah, the barbecue didn't go as planned. The training wasn't perfect. But every misstep led us right here, to this moment of quiet, shared understanding between an old man and his stubborn beagle. And honestly, I wouldn't trade it for anything.